If you think a single security camera can't change an entire neighborhood, wait until you hear what happened on Maple Ridge Drive. Daniel Carter never imagined that a quiet Tuesday morning would become the beginning of the strangest week of his life. He stepped outside with a mug of coffee, expecting nothing more than the usual sounds of sprinklers, distant lawn mowers, and kids waiting for the school bus. Instead, his eyes locked onto 3 bright violation notices attached to the windshield of his pickup truck. For a moment, he simply stared, convinced they had been placed on the wrong vehicle. He pulled the first notice free and read it twice. Unauthorized overnight parking. Improper vehicle placement. Repeated community rule violations. His name appeared at the top of every page. Daniel frowned. His truck had been parked in his own driveway, exactly where it had been every night for the past 4 years. The second notice warned of escalating fines. The third announced that additional action could follow if the violations continued. None of it made sense. He looked up and noticed curtains shifting across the street. A neighbor watering flowers slowed down just enough to glance in his direction before looking away. Another resident walking a dog offered a quick nod but avoided stopping to talk. Something had already changed, and Daniel could feel it before anyone said a word. As he folded the papers into his pocket, his phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line carried the official logo of the Homeowners Association. It confirmed that Linda Mercer, the HOA president, had documented multiple violations and expected immediate compliance. Daniel reread the message, searching for details that explained how anyone could believe he had broken rules that he knew he had followed. There were no photographs attached, no timeline, only statements presented as unquestionable facts. He took several slow breaths before walking back inside. Getting angry would solve nothing. There had to be a reasonable explanation. 20 minutes later, he drove to work, but the notices stayed on his mind through every meeting. Around lunchtime, another message appeared, this time reminding him that failure to respond within 48 hours could result in additional penalties. The timing bothered him even more than the warning itself. It felt organized, almost as if someone wanted him to react without thinking. That evening, Daniel returned home and noticed Linda Mercer standing near the entrance of the neighborhood, speaking with 2 board members. As his truck rolled past, the conversation paused. Linda briefly looked toward him before continuing as if nothing had happened. Daniel parked in his driveway and walked toward his front porch, determined to ask simple questions without creating unnecessary conflict. Before he could reach the sidewalk, Linda called his name with a calm but unmistakably firm voice. She reminded him that the community expected every resident to respect the rules equally and said the written notices spoke for themselves. Daniel replied politely that he believed a mistake had been made because his truck had never left his driveway overnight. Linda answered with a measured smile and simply said, "The records tell a different story." Then she turned and walked away. Daniel stood silently, watching her disappear around the corner while the evening breeze carried the sound of distant garage doors closing. He glanced toward the small security camera mounted beneath the corner of his roof, barely noticing it, as the porch light switched on automatically. At that moment, it was nothing more than another piece of everyday equipment. Within days, it would become the one thing no one in the neighborhood could ignore. Daniel barely slept that night, because every time he closed his eyes, he heard Linda Mercer calmly repeating that the records told a different story. The words did not sound like an accusation anymore. They sounded like a conclusion that had already been accepted by everyone else. Early the next morning, he walked outside, determined to begin collecting answers instead of worrying about questions. Before he even reached his mailbox, another envelope carrying the Homeowners Association logo was waiting for him. Inside was a formal notice scheduling a compliance review for the end of the week. It explained that repeated violations could affect his standing within the community if they remained unresolved. Daniel read every line carefully. Once again, there were no photographs, no dates beyond general references, and no explanation describing exactly when his truck had supposedly been parked incorrectly. The lack of detail bothered him more than the warning itself. Across the street, Mrs. Reynolds paused while trimming her roses. She gave Daniel a polite smile before quietly asking whether everything was all right. Daniel explained that he believed the notices had been issued by mistake. She hesitated before admitting that she had heard several neighbors mention his name during a recent HOA board discussion. No one seemed certain what had happened, But the conversation had spread faster than anyone expected. Daniel thanked her and continued toward his truck, realizing that rumors had already begun filling the empty spaces left by missing facts. Later that afternoon, he called the HOA office hoping someone could explain the evidence supporting the violations. A receptionist politely informed him that all documentation had been reviewed by President Linda Mercer and would be discussed only during the scheduled compliance meeting. Daniel asked whether he could at least receive copies before the meeting so he could prepare. The answer remained the same. He would have to wait. As the call ended, frustration slowly replaced confusion. Something about the process felt unusually one-sided. After work, he drove through the neighborhood at the posted speed limit and noticed several residents standing in small groups near their driveways. Conversations paused as his truck approached before quietly resuming after he passed. No one openly confronted him, yet the silence felt louder than any argument could have been. When he reached home, he found another surprise waiting near his front door. A bright orange reminder had been attached to the handle stating that continued noncompliance could result in additional administrative action. Daniel removed it carefully, folded it into his growing stack of notices, and looked around his property once more. Everything appeared exactly as it had for years. His lawn was neatly trimmed. The trash bins were stored properly. The truck remained centered in the driveway with plenty of clearance. Nothing explained the escalating claims. As sunset settled across Maple Ridge Drive, his next-door neighbor, Michael Harris, walked over carrying a toolbox after finishing repairs on his own fence. He quietly asked Daniel whether the HOA was really claiming the truck had been parked somewhere else overnight. Daniel nodded. Michael frowned and glanced toward the row of homes lining the street. Then he said something that immediately caught Daniel's attention. Several houses, including his own, had security cameras facing different angles of the neighborhood entrance and driveways. Michael admitted he had never paid much attention to the recordings because nothing unusual ever happened there. Then he looked back at Daniel and added, almost as an afterthought, that those cameras probably remembered every single night, even if the neighbors did not. Daniel slowly turned toward the small camera mounted beneath the corner of his roof, and for the first time he realized that while memories could become uncertain, recorded time almost never did. Daniel did not wait until the weekend meeting. As soon as Michael Harris returned home, Daniel carried his laptop across the lawn, hoping the answer was hiding somewhere inside a folder that no one had opened in months. Michael welcomed him inside and pulled up the recordings from the camera mounted above his garage. Together they selected the dates listed on the notices and began watching the footage one evening at a time. The process was slow. Hours passed as they skipped through quiet nights filled with little more than porch lights switching on, delivery trucks passing by, and neighbors returning home from work. Then something unexpected happened. On every night mentioned by the Homeowners Association, Daniel's pickup truck remained parked in the exact same position from sunset until sunrise. The timestamps matched perfectly. There was no unexplained movement, no late-night parking somewhere else, and no sign that the truck had violated the community rules. Daniel leaned back in his chair, feeling relief for the first time in days. The accusations were clearly inconsistent with what the camera had recorded. Michael suggested checking Daniel's own security system just to make certain there were no missing details. Minutes later, they were reviewing footage from the camera attached beneath Daniel's roof. The angle covered the driveway even more clearly. Once again, every recording confirmed the same simple fact. The truck never left. Daniel quietly smiled, believing the problem would finally be easy to solve. He copied the video files onto a portable drive and organized them by date so they could be shown during the compliance meeting. The next morning, he called the Homeowners Association office again and politely explained that he had video recordings contradicting every violation notice. He requested that the board review the footage before the scheduled meeting to avoid wasting everyone's time. The receptionist placed him on hold for several minutes before returning with a short response. President Linda Mercer would not review outside material until the official hearing. Daniel thanked her and ended the call, but the refusal raised even more questions. If the goal was simply to determine the truth, why refuse to look at evidence that might immediately resolve the disagreement? That afternoon, another email arrived from Linda herself. The message reminded Daniel that residents were expected to cooperate with community procedures and warned against attempting to influence board members outside the formal process. The wording remained polite, yet it carried an unmistakable message that the decision had already been framed. Daniel printed the email and added it to the growing folder on his kitchen table. As evening approached, he noticed two more neighbors slowing their evening walk when they reached his driveway. They hesitated before introducing themselves. One admitted that several people had heard Daniel was refusing to follow neighborhood standards. Instead of arguing, Daniel simply invited them to watch a few minutes of the recordings. Within moments, both neighbors exchanged surprised looks as the screen clearly showed the truck remaining motionless throughout the entire night. Neither person offered an explanation. They simply thanked Daniel and continued walking, speaking quietly to one another as they disappeared down the sidewalk. Before going back inside, Daniel looked around Maple Ridge Drive with new eyes. What had started as a disagreement about parking no longer felt like an ordinary misunderstanding. The facts were beginning to point in one direction, while the official claims continued moving in another. Standing beneath the porch light, he realized that proving his own innocence might only be the first step. The far more difficult question was why someone had been so determined to insist on a story that the cameras were quietly refusing to support. The compliance meeting arrived faster than Daniel expected, and by early Saturday evening the neighborhood clubhouse parking lot was nearly full. Residents greeted one another with friendly smiles. Yet Daniel noticed more than a few curious glances following him as he walked toward the entrance carrying a neatly organized folder and the portable drive containing every security recording. Inside the meeting room, rows of folding chairs faced a long table where Linda Mercer and the other board members quietly arranged stacks of paperwork. The atmosphere felt unusually formal for what should have been a simple discussion about parking. After routine announcements ended, Linda calmly called Daniel's name and invited him to sit before the board. She reviewed the alleged violations one by one, reading dates and descriptions with complete confidence. According to the official records, Daniel's truck had repeatedly remained outside approved parking guidelines during overnight hours. When she finished, several residents nodded as though the matter had already been settled. Daniel waited until she finished speaking before politely asking a single question. He requested to see the photographs or documentation supporting those conclusions. Linda briefly looked through her papers before replying that the board relied on inspection reports prepared during routine neighborhood reviews. Daniel asked whether those reports included photographs, timestamps, or any visual confirmation. A short silence filled the room before Linda answered that written inspection records were sufficient under community procedures. Daniel slowly placed his folder on the table and explained that he had brought something far more precise than handwritten observations. He held up the portable drive and informed everyone that multiple security cameras had recorded his driveway throughout every night listed in the violation notices. Several people in the audience immediately exchanged surprised looks. One board member quietly leaned toward Linda and whispered something that Daniel could not hear. Linda remained composed and stated that outside materials would be considered only after the board completed its internal review. Daniel respectfully replied that the recordings directly addressed every allegation being discussed at that very moment. He was not introducing unrelated information. He was presenting a complete timeline. Before Linda could respond, Michael Harris stood from the audience and calmly confirmed that one of the recordings came from his own security system across the street. He explained that his camera independently verified the same dates from a different angle. A quiet murmur spread across the room. Then Mrs. Reynolds slowly raised her hand and admitted that she also owned a camera facing part of the street. She had not reviewed it yet, but she was willing to do so if it helped establish the facts. Suddenly, what had appeared to be a disagreement between one homeowner and the board began involving the entire neighborhood. Linda thanked everyone for their comments, but insisted that the meeting continue according to procedure. She announced that the board would postpone any review of outside recordings until a later date and attempted to move to the next agenda item. Daniel did not interrupt her. Instead, he simply asked whether there was any reason accurate video evidence should be delayed while written accusations were accepted immediately. No one answered right away. Even residents who had quietly supported the board earlier now appeared uncertain. As the meeting finally adjourned, small conversations formed throughout the clubhouse instead of people leaving immediately. Daniel noticed neighbors introducing themselves to one another, discussing camera angles, recording dates, and whether their own systems might have captured additional details. What had started with one portable drive had suddenly become something much larger. As Daniel walked toward the parking lot under the fading evening light, his phone vibrated with a new message from an unfamiliar number. It contained only one sentence. Check the camera facing the neighborhood entrance. You are missing the beginning of the story. Daniel read the anonymous message 3 more times before placing his phone on the passenger seat. The words were too specific to ignore. Someone inside the neighborhood clearly knew there was more to the story than the violation notices suggested. Early the next morning, he drove to the community entrance where a decorative stone sign welcomed residents to Maple Ridge Drive. Mounted above the security gate was a camera maintained by the Homeowners Association, but Daniel also noticed 2 private homes positioned near the entrance with their own visible cameras facing the street. He decided to begin there. The first homeowner, Robert Ellis, listened carefully as Daniel explained the situation. Robert admitted that he rarely checked his recordings, but after hearing about the meeting the previous evening, he agreed to help. Within minutes, they were reviewing archived footage from the same nights listed in the HOA documents. Daniel expected another confirmation that his truck had never left the driveway. Instead, the camera revealed something unexpected. Just before midnight on the first recorded date, Linda Mercer slowly drove through the neighborhood entrance in her sport utility vehicle after having already returned home earlier that evening. She parked near the clubhouse for several minutes before driving deeper into the neighborhood. There was nothing improper about the trip itself, yet the timing immediately caught Daniel's attention because it matched the approximate period when the inspection report claimed his truck had supposedly been violating the parking rules. Robert quietly pointed at the screen and noted that Linda was carrying a clipboard when she left the clubhouse parking area. Curious now, they continued reviewing the remaining nights. On every date connected to the notices, Linda's vehicle appeared at nearly the same late hour, following almost the identical route. Daniel remained silent while copying the clips onto his portable drive. The pattern did not prove wrongdoing, but it raised a question that no one had asked before. Why were inspections taking place so late? And why did none of the reports include photographs if someone was already driving directly past the properties? Later that afternoon, Daniel visited another neighbor whose driveway camera overlooked a different section of the street. The footage added another small piece to the puzzle. Linda's vehicle could be seen slowing near Daniel's house for less than a minute before continuing forward. From that angle, Daniel's pickup truck was visible the entire time, parked exactly where it had remained all night. Michael joined them as they compared timestamps from every available recording. Each camera overlapped the next, creating a nearly continuous timeline across the neighborhood. The more footage they collected, the clearer the sequence became. The written inspection reports described events that the combined recordings simply did not support. By early evening, word had quietly spread that several neighbors were reviewing their own cameras. Daniel's phone began receiving messages from residents offering additional recordings from different dates. None of them accused anyone directly. They simply wanted the facts to be complete before another meeting took place. As Daniel organized every file into chronological order, he noticed one final detail hidden within the overlapping videos. Just minutes before the first violation was supposedly documented, another vehicle had briefly entered the neighborhood, stopped near the clubhouse, and left without approaching any homes. The license plate could not be read from the available angle, but the unexpected arrival created a gap in the story that no inspection report mentioned. Daniel realized that the evidence was no longer limited to proving where his truck had been parked. The growing collection of recordings was beginning to reveal an entirely different timeline, one that someone had either overlooked or chosen not to include, and for the first time he believed the truth would depend on every camera working together rather than any single recording alone. Daniel spent the next 2 evenings organizing every recording into a single timeline that anyone could follow without technical knowledge. Each video was labeled by date, time, and camera location so the sequence remained easy to understand. Michael Harris helped compare the timestamps while Robert Ellis verified that every file had been copied directly from the original recordings without any edits. The result was a complete visual record stretching across several nights, and every piece supported the same conclusion. Daniel's truck had remained in his driveway exactly where it belonged. Before Daniel could request another meeting, An electronic notice arrived from the Homeowners Association announcing that the board would conduct a formal review of the ongoing dispute later that week. The message also stated that residents with relevant information could attend and provide statements if requested. Daniel quietly smiled because, for the first time since receiving the violation notices, the process finally allowed the evidence to speak for itself. News of the upcoming review spread quickly throughout Maple Ridge Drive. Instead of discussing rumors, neighbors began talking about camera angles, recording times, and how surprisingly useful their security systems had become. Several residents who had remained silent earlier now contacted Daniel, explaining that they had also reviewed archived footage and were willing to confirm what they had seen. No one wanted unnecessary conflict. They simply wanted the situation resolved fairly. On the afternoon before the meeting, Daniel received an unexpected telephone call from the community management company that handled administrative services for the neighborhood. A representative politely explained that multiple residents had contacted the office requesting an objective review of the available recordings before any additional penalties were issued. The representative emphasized that the goal was to ensure the association's records accurately reflected the facts. Daniel appreciated the professional tone and agreed to provide copies of the timeline and supporting videos. Later that evening, as Daniel finished organizing his documents, another discovery emerged. While comparing footage from 3 different homes, Michael noticed that the inspection reports listed specific observation times that did not match the visible movements recorded by several cameras. At one listed time, Linda Mercer's vehicle was still approaching Daniel's street rather than already documenting his property. The difference measured only a few minutes, but it meant the written timeline could not be fully reconciled with the recorded sequence. Daniel did not jump to conclusions. Instead, he highlighted the discrepancy and added it to the presentation without making accusations. He wanted the review to focus entirely on verifiable facts rather than assumptions. The evening of the formal review arrived with far more residents attending than anyone expected. Folding chairs filled quickly as neighbors quietly greeted one another. The atmosphere felt different from the previous meeting. There was less whispering and far more curiosity. Linda Mercer opened the session with her usual confidence, explaining that the board welcomed accurate information from all parties before reaching a final decision. Daniel listened carefully before standing with his folder and portable drive. He thanked the board for allowing the material to be reviewed and explained that the recordings had been arranged into one continuous timeline using footage from several independent homes. As the first video appeared on the screen, the room became completely silent. One recording blended naturally into the next, showing the driveway from different perspectives throughout the night. Every transition confirmed the same location, the same parked truck, and the same uninterrupted sequence of events. Then another clip appeared, showing Linda's vehicle traveling through the neighborhood during the exact period referenced by the inspection report. Several residents leaned forward as the matching timestamps appeared beside both recordings. No one spoke. Everyone waited to see how the remaining minutes of the timeline would fit together, because it was becoming increasingly clear that the complete story had only just begun to reveal itself. The final clips in Daniel's presentation answered questions that no one in the room had even known to ask. As the synchronized recordings continued playing on the large screen, every camera confirmed the same uninterrupted sequence. Daniel's pickup truck remained parked in the center of his driveway from late evening until sunrise on every date listed in the violation notices. The overlapping timestamps left no meaningful gaps. When the presentation reached the point where Linda Mercer's inspection reports claimed the violations had been observed, Michael Harris quietly displayed a side-by-side comparison. One screen showed the written inspection time. The other showed Linda's vehicle still driving toward Daniel's street several minutes before reaching his property. The room remained completely silent as everyone realized the two timelines could not both be accurate. Daniel did not raise his voice or accuse anyone of acting intentionally. He simply explained how the recordings had been collected independently from multiple homeowners and preserved in their original formats. Robert Ellis confirmed that every file had been copied directly from the source devices without alteration. Mrs. Reynolds then stood and explained that after reviewing her own archived recordings, she had reached the same conclusion. Nothing visible on any camera supported the parking violations described in the official notices. One by one, Additional residents quietly acknowledged that they had reviewed their own systems and found nothing inconsistent with Daniel's presentation. What had begun as one homeowner defending himself had become a neighborhood verifying the same facts together. Linda Mercer asked for a brief pause while the board privately reviewed the material. During the recess, conversations filled the clubhouse. Neighbors who had avoided Daniel only days earlier now approached him with questions, apologies, and words of encouragement. Several admitted they had accepted the written notices without ever imagining that multiple security cameras could reconstruct an entire timeline so precisely. Daniel thanked each person politely, reminding them that everyone had simply wanted accurate information. When the board returned to the table, the community management representative addressed the room before Linda could speak. The representative explained that the synchronized recordings appeared consistent, complete, and directly relevant to the reported violations. Because the evidence raised significant questions about the inspection records, all pending fines and enforcement actions against Daniel would be suspended immediately while an administrative review was completed. A quiet wave of relief moved through the audience. Daniel finally felt the pressure that had followed him for days begin to disappear. Linda acknowledged the announcement with a calm expression and stated that the board supported a full review of the documentation. Before the meeting ended, one board member asked whether anyone knew why the anonymous message had encouraged Daniel to examine the entrance camera. No one answered. The question lingered in the room for several moments before fading into silence. As residents slowly gathered their belongings, the community management representative requested copies of every recording and every inspection report so an independent comparison could be completed. Daniel willingly handed over his organized files without hesitation. Walking toward the exit, he noticed neighbors speaking openly with one another instead of whispering behind closed doors. Trust was beginning to replace speculation. Yet as Daniel stepped outside into the cool evening air, his phone vibrated once again with another anonymous message. It contained only a single sentence. "You have proven what happened to your truck, but the reports were not the original reason the cameras mattered." Suddenly Daniel realized the investigation had quietly expanded beyond his own driveway, and whatever the complete truth was, it had not fully revealed itself yet. Daniel spent the next several days thinking about the anonymous message far more than he wanted to admit. The parking dispute had already begun falling apart under the weight of the recordings, yet someone continued insisting that the cameras had captured something even more important. Instead of searching for new theories, Daniel decided to review every available recording from the beginning without focusing only on his own driveway. Michael Harris, Robert Ellis, and several other neighbors joined him in the clubhouse conference room after receiving permission from the community management representative to organize the shared footage into one continuous timeline. Hour after hour, they watched ordinary moments that most people would never notice. Delivery trucks entered and left the neighborhood. Families returned home from work. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Nothing seemed unusual until Michael paused one recording and quietly asked everyone to compare it with another camera facing the clubhouse parking lot. The difference was subtle but impossible to ignore. On the evenings when Daniel supposedly violated the parking rules, Linda Mercer consistently arrived at the clubhouse well before the inspection times listed in the reports. However, the synchronized recordings showed that no inspection actually began until after she spent several minutes inside the building reviewing paperwork. More importantly, the cameras demonstrated that the written observation times could not have been created during the moments described because her vehicle remained visible somewhere else within the neighborhood. Daniel carefully documented every discrepancy without making personal accusations. The goal remained exactly the same as it had always been. Let the verified timeline speak for itself. The completed comparison was delivered to the community management company, which arranged one final public meeting so the administrative review could be presented to residents. The clubhouse filled even faster than before. This time the atmosphere felt noticeably calmer because everyone understood that the discussion would center on documented facts rather than neighborhood rumors. After thanking the residents for their patience, the community management representative explained that every inspection report had been compared with synchronized recordings from multiple independent security cameras. The review concluded that the evidence supporting the violation notices could not be verified through the available timeline. As a result, Every citation issued to Daniel would be permanently withdrawn, all related fines would be canceled, and the official records would be corrected to reflect the findings. A quiet round of applause spread through the room. Daniel felt an enormous sense of relief, but the representative was not finished. The review had also recommended significant procedural changes. Future violation reports would require supporting documentation whenever reasonably available, and residents would be given an opportunity to review relevant evidence before enforcement decisions became final. Several neighbors nodded in agreement, recognizing that the situation had revealed weaknesses affecting everyone, not just Daniel. Linda Mercer stood and addressed the room with a measured voice. She acknowledged the outcome of the review and accepted the corrected record, stating that the board would cooperate fully with the updated procedures moving forward. Daniel appreciated that the conversation remained respectful from beginning to end. There was no celebration over another person's embarrassment, only a shared understanding that better processes would benefit the entire community. As the meeting concluded, neighbors who had once avoided Daniel now stopped to shake his hand, thanking him for remaining patient instead of responding with anger. Walking outside beneath the warm evening sky, Daniel looked toward the familiar security camera mounted beneath his roof. Days earlier, it had seemed like nothing more than ordinary household equipment. Now it represented something much larger. Not because it favored one person over another, but because it quietly preserved the truth while memories, assumptions, and rumors continued to change around it. Over the following weeks, life on Maple Ridge Drive slowly returned to the quiet routine that Daniel Carter had always appreciated, but the neighborhood itself was no longer quite the same. People who had once hurried past one another without making eye contact now stopped to talk at their mailboxes, exchanged friendly greetings during evening walks, and discovered that simple conversations solved problems much faster than assumptions ever could. Daniel noticed the difference almost immediately. Instead of feeling like someone living under constant observation, he once again felt like a neighbor. The Homeowners Association also began implementing the recommendations from the administrative review. Inspection procedures became more transparent, documentation standards were updated, and residents received clearer opportunities to respond before any enforcement decisions became final. The changes did not eliminate disagreements, because every community occasionally faced misunderstandings, but they created a process that encouraged facts before conclusions. Daniel quietly appreciated that outcome more than any apology could have provided. One Saturday morning, while trimming the hedges along his front yard, he saw Linda Mercer walking down the sidewalk with several board members after a community planning session. She paused near his driveway and greeted him politely. Their conversation lasted only a few minutes, focusing entirely on upcoming landscaping improvements and neighborhood events. There was no discussion about the past because neither of them needed to revisit it. The official records had already been corrected, and everyone understood what had happened. As Linda continued walking, Daniel realized something important. Real respect inside a community was not created by winning arguments. It came from treating people fairly even when opinions differed. Later that afternoon, Michael Harris and Robert Ellis stopped by with coffee, joking that they probably knew more about security camera time stamps than they had ever expected to learn. The three neighbors laughed together while standing beside the same driveway that had unexpectedly become the center of so much attention only weeks earlier. Looking around the peaceful street, Daniel noticed children riding bicycles, families tending gardens, and delivery trucks making ordinary afternoon stops. Everything appeared completely normal again, yet he understood that the neighborhood had quietly learned a valuable lesson. Facts remained steady even when rumors traveled quickly. Evidence deserved patience before judgment. Most importantly, communities became stronger when neighbors worked together instead of choosing sides before the full story was known. That evening, Daniel reviewed the archived recordings one final time before organizing them into a folder and storing the drive inside a desk drawer. He did not keep the files because he expected another dispute. He kept them as a reminder that calm persistence had accomplished far more than frustration ever could. Before shutting down his computer, Daniel noticed the anonymous messages that had guided him toward the entrance cameras. The sender had never revealed an identity, and despite everything that had happened, no one ever claimed responsibility. For a brief moment, Daniel considered trying to discover who had sent them, but then he quietly closed the messages without another thought. Whoever that person had been, the information had encouraged people to look for the truth instead of accepting incomplete conclusions. That was enough. As the porch light switched on automatically, and the familiar security camera continued recording another peaceful evening, Daniel smiled to himself. The camera had never taken sides. It had never argued, interrupted, or demanded attention. It had simply recorded ordinary moments exactly as they happened. In the end, that quiet consistency accomplished something remarkable. It reminded an entire neighborhood that trust is strongest when it is built on honesty, patience, and the willingness to let the truth speak for itself.